Hello everybody, my name is Chris, and this is the second in my series that I'm doing called Blueprint for Composition. So I just want to give a little bit of a background as to why I'm doing this particular series at this time. So as I mentioned in the first installment of this series, I work with international students whose first language may not be English, and in generally it is the case that their first language is not English. So what I do in my classroom is I try to help these students improve their writing skills. And by doing that, I focus on a lot of grammar instruction and grammar practice for the students to help them develop their ability to write more effective sentences. So primarily my responsibility is working with the international students in my school and trying to help them improve their academic writing skills along with reading skills and other academic vocabulary and that kind of thing. But it occurred to me that this kind of information that we're going to be going over in this series will also be valuable for people who are high school students in general, because on a test such as the SAT, there are sections of the SAT which are called written expression. And in these written expression questions, you have to have a knowledge of grammar and an understanding of how sentences are put together in order to, in one section, for example, you have to identify errors in sentences out of 4 underlined words. And these are based on grammatical principles. These errors that appear in these sentences have to do with a lot of grammar knowledge. And also in the case of revising sentences, there's a section on the SAT where you have to choose a correct revision for a sentence, or if the sentence needs no revision. So how to revise sentences is also based on partly how sentences are put together and how sentences are organized. So there's definitely a section on the SAT which covers that information. Now also, even those students who are in college or universities who might be preparing for a career as a teacher, let's say someone wants to become a teacher of English language arts, for example, at whatever grade, these grammatical principles that we're going to be going over in this series are also something that you guys who are studying in colleges and universities for a career in education, you need to know. And the reason for that is this. In the state of Massachusetts, I know because I went through this process myself, there are 2 kinds of tests that people have to take in order to become licensed as public school teachers in the state of Massachusetts. Now, I'm familiar with other states in the New England area that also give similar kinds of tests, but I'm not sure, about every state in the whole United States. But particularly for New England and Massachusetts, where I took my education licensure tests, there are 2 types of tests that you need to take. One is called the Communication and Literacy Test. And on this Communication and Literacy Test, which you have to pass with a 70% or higher in the state of Massachusetts, there are a lot of questions in particular parts of this Communication and Literacy Test which require you to know a lot about grammar and a lot about how sentences are structured and organized and different parts of a sentence and how to identify errors and this kind of thing, as we discussed. So everybody who wants to become a public school teacher in the state of Massachusetts, no matter what grade 1 through 12, these people have to take this Communication and Literacy Test. And they have to pass it with a 70%. And I've seen various websites which are designed specifically for teaching this kind of information that we're going to be going over in this series. And these websites may be free or they may charge a kind of subscription fee. I've seen various ways that it's done. But in my case, you can get it for free. So the state of Massachusetts is raking in millions and millions and millions of dollars every year from these education licensure tests, particularly the Communication and Literacy Test. When I took my test about 10 years ago, there was about 150 people in the building that day who were testing, and everybody had to pay at least $50 or $75 to take that test. So you can judge, how much that's going to accrue in terms of how much money the state is making off these tests. And the other test is called the subject test. So if you were supposedly going to be a English language arts teacher, you would have to take the Communication Literacy Test and the English subject test, which I also took, but today we'll just focus on the Communication and Literacy Test. And it's the same for history, foreign language, science, math. Everybody who wants to be a teacher has to become knowledgeable in their subject area for sure, but also they have to be knowledgeable in the foundations of literacy and language. So when we study these things in elementary school and junior high school, grammar, construction, diagramming sentences, all of this kind of thing, we learn these terms, we learn these vocabulary words related to grammar, and we acquire a knowledge of these things, so it becomes, by the time we're in high school, a kind of second nature. But in colleges, universities, and if you're studying for these kinds of SAT tests or the communication literacy test, as I mentioned, these have grammar sections which require very detailed knowledge of grammar and sentence construction. So a lot of times we forget these things. We forget the rules. We forget the terms. We forget how to explain and why something is right and why something is not right. And we have to explain and analyze why these things are right and wrong. So, in my case, I forgot many of these rules. We always sort of fall back on, well, if it sounds right, it is right. And if it doesn't sound right, that means it's wrong. Well, that's a very tricky sort of area to get into with the sounds right rule. So I always try to tell my students, you can't rely on the sounds right rule, because if it sounds right because you say it all the time or you hear people saying it all the time, it may not be grammatically correct, but people say it as a matter of course because it's part of our conversational language. So that's a tricky way to go about trying to analyze a sentence. If it sounds right, it's right. If it doesn't sound right, it's not right. So these kinds of things can be problematic as an approach if you're not familiar with these. So there was one time when I was teaching at a college with international students, and one of the students asked me a question about the difference between active and passive voice. And these two terms, active and passive voice, probably I heard when I was in elementary school or middle school, and maybe even 7th, 8th grade, but completely forgot what the definition or distinction between these two terms were. So I'm standing up in the middle of the classroom and I'm thinking, you know what, I have no idea what the difference is between these two terms. How am I supposed to explain an answer to his question if I don't know myself? So for me, that was a very sort of immediate wake-up call. I need to go back and review these things. I need to go back and learn these things because I am responsible for teaching these people. I can't be standing up in a classroom and somebody asks me a question and it's a basic grammatical principle, active voice and passive voice, and I'm up there, well, I think, you know what, let me get back to you on that, and, really embarrassing kind of thing. So my point is this, the days of Schoolhouse Rock, conjunction, junction, and adverbs and adjectives and all those musical numbers that they used to put on Saturday morning television to educate the masses here, those days are long since past. I grew up on them, and a lot of the teachers who I work with in my school in the English Language Arts Department, they are familiar with those as well, but those days are long gone. So we have the responsibility to go back and learn these things if we're going to be standing up in front of a group of students and trying to transmit this knowledge to the people in front of us, and do it well and do it properly, so that they don't grow up and have to be wondering about these different types of things as well. So that's the general reason for this course. So I'm saying it could be helpful for not only students in high school as well as college universities, but also those students who are planning to become teachers, because there's no getting around these education licensure tests nowadays. So during the course of this series, you'll learn a lot of vocabulary and review a great deal of how sentences are constructed, and how to put the ideas together well, and know what is the difference between this and that, and how this works and how that works, and why this is a certain way and why that's a certain way. So let's get into the specifics. So yesterday in the installment we talked about different types of phrases and clauses. Well, yesterday's video focused mostly on clauses, so let's just give a quick overview of that. So you need to know these terms. Clause means a group of words with at least one subject and one verb. So that's consistent with the definition of the word clause. But there are different types of clauses. So we have to know what the different types of clauses are and what the different types of clauses are called and what they have as their foundation and how they are used in different ways. So the first thing we talked in the video focused on the independent clause. So the first type of clause that we talked about was the independent clause, which is defined as a clause which does have one subject and one verb. But in order to be an independent clause, it must also be a complete idea. So as you see here, a clause is defined as a group of words with one subject and one verb. But the independent clause must have one subject and one verb at the minimum, but also, and, this is a very important and here, is a complete idea. Because there are other types of clauses that have a subject and verb, but they're not complete ideas by themselves. An independent clause is. So, another word for an independent clause is a simple sentence. So a simple sentence, we looked at in the previous video, is a sentence composed of one independent clause only. Okay? So the definition of simple sentence is a sentence composed of one independent clause. And I mentioned that generally in the case of statements, it will end with a period. Now, there are other ways that you can punctuate the ends of sentences with an exclamation point, for example. But we're talking about statements here. So we're not talking about questions at this point because questions involve a slightly different word order in a lot of cases. So we're focusing on statements. So to give an example of an independent clause, here, John went to the beach. Okay? So we're going to have to look at the sentence and analyze the parts of the sentence, which we started to do in the previous video. So all of a sudden, you're supposed to know all these things and identify all these things. So John is our subject. Here, I'll label S for subject. John is a person, so it is a noun. We talked about it yet in the video at that time. What kinds of words can be subjects? Nouns generally are the most common types of subjects. So John would be a noun, a person. So nouns, we said, are persons, places, things, or ideas. So in any case, John is a person in the subject. Now, for English composition, sentences in English, generally if they are statements, they're going to start with the subject. Okay? So where can we look in a sentence to find a subject? 9 times out of 10, if it's a statement, the subject will be in front of the verb. So that is one easy way to locate a sentence subject, is to look at the beginning of a sentence if it's a statement, because that's where you generally find the sentence subject in English. And then after the subject, 9 times out of 10, you have the verb. So went is our verb. And we talked about the fact that verbs such as this are called action verbs. So action verbs obviously are very common because they show something that people do. So John is a person. What did he do? He went somewhere. So went, being the past tense form of the verb go, is also an action verb. It just happens to be in the past tense. So when this student asked me about passive voice, I was thinking, what does he mean? Past tense? Like yesterday something? No. Don't confuse past tense with passive verbs. We'll get to passive verbs at another time, but past tense means some action that took place before now. So John went somewhere. Now, John went to the beach. Sentence ends right here with the period. This is a complete thought. This is a complete idea. It has one subject, it has one verb, and it expresses a complete idea. Therefore, it qualifies as an independent clause, and it also qualifies as a simple sentence. Okay? Now, let's jump down to the definition of phrase, because we did not talk about phrases yesterday in great detail. So, a phrase, by definition, is a group of words without a subject and or verb. Okay? So, a phrase cannot stand by itself as a separate sentence because it lacks the essential components of a sentence. It does not have a subject, it does not have a verb. It may have a verb, it may have a noun, but it's not a sentence. So therefore, if you put it into a separate sentence with a period as itself standing alone, it's called a fragment. It's not a complete idea. So whenever you put a sentence together in academic formal grammar, which does not have these components in the particular order and in the correct position, then it becomes a fragment. And that is something that you would have to identify on these tests, for example, how to identify fragments and things of this nature. So, sentence parts without a subject and verb is called a phrase. All right? Now, one type of very common phrase in writing, in grammar, is called the prepositional phrase. All right? So a prepositional phrase is something that is added onto a sentence to give it more detail or to give it better understanding of what the whole circumstance of that idea is. So, in the sentence above here, John went to the beach, it is actually the case that this part of the sentence over here, to the beach, this is actually a phrase. And this is actually a prepositional phrase. So I'm going to abbreviate that as a prepositional phrase. So just this part of the sentence, to the beach, is a prepositional phrase. We'll come back to that in a moment. There are different types of prepositional phrases. So a prepositional phrase begins with a preposition and it contains an object, noun, or pronoun. All right? There are other types of objects for prepositional phrases, potentially, but the most common, of course, would be an object, noun, or pronoun. So, just quickly, two different types of prepositional phrases here. Prepositional phrases which indicate time. For example, in the morning. You could also say in the afternoon or in the evening, but you would say at night. And you could also say, for example, at a particular time, a specific time. At 9 o'clock, at 12, at 10:30. Those are time phrases. Okay? Prepositional phrases of time. Another very common type of prepositional phrase is the prepositional phrase of location. All right? So where, it describes a place where something is or where someone is. So at the park, for example, would be a prepositional phrase of location. So what are some general common prepositions? Well, there are many, many words that we can use as prepositions, but just quickly let me rattle off a few here. So for would be a preposition. Of would be a preposition. In, at, on, under, between. These types of words, we could go on and on, but these types of words are prepositions. These words, prepositions, are, as I said, followed by an object, noun, or pronoun. So, when we are looking at sentences and analyzing the different components of sentences, we have to understand the relationship between the words and where they are located in a sentence. So, John went to the beach. The prepositional phrase, to the beach, adds more information and gives more detail about where did John go. John went where? John went to the beach. So, this is a prepositional phrase, and it is a prepositional phrase of location. John went to the beach. Now, look at the position. Here's our preposition. Here's our object of the preposition. So, beach here is a noun, because it's a place. That's the object of this preposition to. So we have to understand, all prepositions are followed by an object of a noun form or a pronoun form or some other kind of form we'll get into later, but beach is a noun. So, as I said, this group of words right here is a prepositional phrase. Now, problem. If I put a period here, and I erase, and I keep that period there, and I erase this T, and I put a capital T there, okay, John went. That's a complete idea by itself, yes. But is to the beach a complete idea? No. To the beach is a phrase. I cannot use a phrase as a separate sentence. So, therefore, if I did this, or if someone were to write this as a sentence, this would be incorrect grammatically because it does not have a complete idea and it's not a complete thought. It is in fact a phrase. So therefore, I can't separate that out from the rest of the sentence. I have to join it with the sentence. All right, I'm still looking at a complete sentence here, and I'm still looking at a simple sentence here, but I just added more detail to give a better understanding of where John went. So one final point is this. Look at the location of the prepositional phrase in the sentence. It comes after the verb. Why? Because I'm describing something about that verb. Where did John go? I don't want to put the phrase at the beginning of the sentence, although in some cases I can, particularly with specifically expressions of time, I could say, in the morning John went to the beach. That's fine. But I don't want to say, to the beach John went. That would be improper word order. Okay? So, to the beach John went. That's not the way we say things, and that's not how sentences are organized here in academic English. So, we can figure out the meaning, but in fact, it is not properly ordered in that way. So, John went where? So, we have to think about these, how to order the words and what location of part of the sentence they need to appear in. So, John went to the beach. All right? So, what we're going to do, I'm going to clear the board, and I'm going to write some expressions up on the board, and we're going to label them clauses or phrases, just for exercise purposes and demonstration purposes. So let's take a quick break here. We'll come back and we'll do that.